Oh, hi! You caught me moving. Speaking of moves, let's talk about the moves that Jeff Smith made with his comic Bone.
Comic tropes. Comic tropes.
Hello, welcome to Comic Tropes. I'm your host, Chris. This week, I want to talk about Bone by Jeff Smith. This is a book that my patrons have requested for quite a while, and now I'm delivering it to you. I think this is a book that has stood the test of time as both an epic fantasy tale and a humor book. It blends two genres you wouldn't necessarily think would go together as well as they do. This book is executed so well. On top of that, it's a huge accomplishment in terms of self-publishing. This book has been honored both financially and critically. Well-deserved, I would argue. So without any further ado, let's take a look at some of the techniques that author and artist Jeff Smith used to create the unique book known as Bone. Jeff Smith grew up drawing his eventual characters from Bone as early as 1970, when he was just 10 years old. At Ohio State University, he produced a comic strip called Thorn, which featured several of the characters he would later use in Bone. After college, he started a small cartooning studio, and he became impressed with comic books like Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns and Art Spiegelman's Mouse, and he was convinced that he could produce a comic book based on his ideas with a beginning, middle, and an end. He began self-publishing Bone in 1991 on a bi-monthly schedule, which had some delays, but he finished Bone with issue 55 in 2004. In retrospect, Bone was very successful on several levels. Smith originally published it as a black and white title, but later signed a deal allowing Scholastic to publish it in colored volumes. It stayed in print and remains a top seller as an all-ages book. But the decision to self-publish in 1991 was pretty brave. There'd been a burst of self-published success in the mid-'80s thanks to titles like Ninja Turtles and Cerebus. But the 90s began to focus on mainstream superhero books and gimmick covers before collapsing in a speculator boom that was temporary. So why did Bone succeed? Well, I'd argue it's a combination of three factors. We've got a well-paced story, we've got some gorgeous artwork, and we have some genuinely funny humor. Let's start by talking about the well-paced story. The story focuses on the three Bone cousins, Fone Bone, Smiley Bone, and Phoney Bone. They've recently been run out of their town thanks to a disastrous mayoral campaign by Phoney, which involved a hot air balloon going astray. They find themselves lost in a desert before a horde of locusts breaks them up, and they find their way individually to a valley. It's a medieval-esque setting, and they befriend a mysterious young woman, Thorn, and her farmer grandmother, Grandma Ben, who has secrets she's holding from her past. They ultimately are all drawn into an ancient feud between men and rat creatures. The rat creatures answer to the mysterious Hooded One, who in turn is helping the Lord of Locusts to escape imprisonment within a mountain. There's also dragons, talking animals, and magic involving knowledge pulled from dreams. That's just a very high-level overview of the plot, but one thing important to note is its use of high fantasy tropes. That includes a magic system, in this case connecting to knowledge or other people through dreams. Further magical elements include dragons and a dark presence known as the Lord of the Locusts that can possess or empower others but has no physical form itself. There is also a pseudo-medieval European setting and a hidden past that affects the present. I would personally count Bone as a great fantasy epic alongside stories like Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones. I think that the only thing in comics that really even comes close to something like Bone is maybe ElfQuest, which is impressive in its own right, but definitely does not have the same wide-reaching appeal that Bone does. And I think part of the reason for that is the blend that Bone has between epic high fantasy tropes and humor. The main characters in all of these stories go on an odyssey, journeying as far from home as possible before returning home changed. The villains of the past lay dormant, ready to rise again to challenge an unexpected new generation. The main characters are reluctant to leave home, but do so for the greater good. The initial third of Bone's story is paced carefully and focuses more on helping us get to know and love the characters. The Bone cousins come from a more modern world that we hear uses paper money, offers tacos, and has printed books like Moby Dick. It's never explained why a book from our world exists there, other than that it's one of author Jeff Smith's favorite books, and he uses it as a recurring gag to have other people fall asleep when Fone Bone, who also loves the novel, tries to read it or talk about it with others. Fone Bone is an everyman. Honest, loyal, friendly, and he harbors a crush for Thorn. As to why the Bone cousins look like bloopy white creatures when humans also exist, it isn't explained, and it doesn't matter. They look that way because Jeff Smith likes cartoons, and the Bone cousins are simplified but allow Smith to express heightened emotions through their gesture and expressions. Their open design also helps us as comic book readers place ourselves in the protagonist's place. Small side note here, Fone Bone was a last name that cartoonist Don Martin often used in his Mad magazine strips. I don't think that's a coincidence. Next in the Bone family is Phoney, who wears a shirt with a star on it and is always hatching a get-rich-quick scheme. He's bossy, grouchy, and self-centered. But over time, you come to realize he took care of Fone Bone and Smiley Bone when they were all young, and his personality developed so that he could provide for his cousins. He's the source of a lot of humor in the first third of the book, trying to trick the villagers on a betting scheme based on a cow race at one point, then challenging bar owner Lucius to see who can run the local tavern better at another. Phoney is based to a large extent on Scrooge McDuck, and Jeff Smith is a fan of artist Carl Barks, who created most of the supporting characters and stories for Donald Duck, including the wealthy and greedy Scrooge. Finally, there is Smiley Bone, a happy-go-lucky doofus who loves everyone. He's a sidekick in the mold of Goofy, tall, gangly, and almost always seen with his tongue sticking out or a cigar in his mouth. For the humans, there are many supporting characters in the village, but the two most important are the young Thorn, who befriends Fone Bone early on and slowly learns about suppressed memories and her true identity, and her Grandma Ben, an incredibly powerful old lady who acts polite but can outfight and outrun almost anyone, and who harbors dark secrets about her family's past. Other key characters include the Red Dragon, who watches over Fone Bone from the shadows for reasons detailed later in the story. There are also the rat creatures, including two unnamed Dimbulbs, who are both a threat and a source for the repeated gag of people calling them stupid, stupid rat creatures as they fail repeatedly. Along the way, we learn more about a battle that devastated a kingdom that existed a generation ago, and how various alliances and truces were formed and broken between men, dragons, Rokejaw, a massive mountain lion, the rat creatures, and a cult known as the Veniyan. The second third of the story introduces these characters, and we are given snippets of the mythology and history of the fictional world of Bone. The final third builds up to a massive battle. If it sounds like I'm being vague on the second and third parts of this comic, it's because I am. You've either already read it and you know what I'm talking about, or hopefully I'm intriguing you about the book. Hopefully I'm interesting you in it, because it really is one of my personal favorite comics, period. While each part of the comic has a mix of humor, drama, and action, they are each emphasized in order as the story proceeds. The humor is often personality-based and timeless. A lot of pages have dialogue between the Bone cousins or the Bones and townspeople. Jeff Smith often utilizes a simple grid panel layout, closely mirroring comic strips. The focus on dialogue and even the design of the bones is reminiscent of one of the comic strips that influenced Jeff Smith, which was Walt Kelly's Pogo. Pogo focused on a possum and his friends that live in a swamp. A lot of the humor was dialogue and personality based, which helps it remain fairly timeless. That humor is a big part of what makes Bone stand out as a unique epic fantasy story. Smith's early years self-publishing Bone meant that he was running a business at the same time as making the comic. It split his focus, so he asked his wife to quit her successful career in Silicon Valley and to run his company. She did, and sales began to grow throughout the rest of his run. In 1995, he took Bone to Image Comics for issues 21 through 27. After that, he and his wife Vijaya continued to publish the comic through its final issue, number 55, as well as several spin-offs and one-shots. Smith had this story very well planned out, and I think it's well paced. He has actually said in interviews that he illustrated the final page of the final issue before he finished illustrating the first issue, so he always knew where it was headed, and I think that really does help. If you had to critique something about the book, I really don't think you could critique the artwork. You either like that or you don't, but I think it's just consistent and gorgeous from day one. If you had to criticize something, maybe you could say that the final third, where it builds up to its epic conclusion, isn't as epic as some other fantasy stories. But I would counter that that's not really true, because it is a big culmination of a lot of different factions gathering together against the forces of darkness. I think it's great. The artwork itself is gorgeous when it reaches for big action, new locations, and dramatic reveals. Smith renders people and animals with a delicate realism. He has a great grasp of anatomy and how to make the characters appear animated and emotional. It's cartooning in the best sense of the word. The original books were released in black and white, but Smith successfully negotiated to retain the rights but publish colored versions through Scholastic from 2004 through 2009. They've been kept in print ever since. The endeavor was something Smith believed in, and his hard work proved lucrative. He's been able to take his time working on projects of his own like Rassel and Tukey and a Captain Marvel series at DC, but he's not obligated to do a monthly title to pay the bills. Bone earned 10 Eisner Awards and 11 Harvey Awards. There's a lot of critical consensus that Bone is something special, and I agree. Sometimes people wonder about a film adaptation. While the artwork of Bone is very well suited for animation, the story pacing may not work well in film. In film adaptations, you often need to pare a story down to the big dramatic beats. But the problem there is that a lot of the reason that Bone works so well as a comic book is that it takes its time, even in the later chapters, to help you get to know the characters. Take some time to do something funny or just something that helps explain character motivations, and that's why you care about the characters as much as you do. That said, when this book was created in 1991, there was no such thing as long-form cinematic storytelling options like HBO has developed or Netflix and other streaming services. So, potentially, there is a way to adapt it that could be satisfying both to new viewers and readers of the original material. Time will tell if that's the case. In the meantime, I definitely recommend Bone. It's funny, it's dramatic, and the artwork is gorgeous. If nothing else, you will enjoy the artwork. But I think that this is a book that truly is all ages. And that does not mean kids or young adult. It really means that it's got something for everyone to enjoy. Anyway, that's my take on Bone. And without any further ado, let's take a quick look at what kind of fan art came in this week. Sheldon Martin has a disturbing piece of art revealing my true nature. Deb Wolf returns with a new comic involving me meeting her character Fred. You can see more of her comics on her website. Artist Jordan Baker Caldwell says he mostly works on sculpture, but was inspired to mash up my show with a favorite comic of his to create Comax tropes. Check out more of Jordan's artwork on his website and Instagram. Bob Preston made this colorful piece featuring me with the power of All Might. Check out more of Bob's work on his ArtStation and Instagram pages. Jeremy sent in this illustration where I'm discussing the manga Hajime no Ippo. For more by Jeremy, check out his Twitter. Seth Leoric was inspired by last week's Strange Spider-Man episode to redesign Mr. Zodiac. That looks much scarier than his original form. This artwork is a mashup between my Blue Beetle and NFL Super Pro episodes. Artist Jeremy Bain includes his Instagram link for more. Finally, Wiley Parkhurst sent in 3 pieces of art where he interprets me, including one where I am a bird warrior, as I was always meant to be. Alright, if you would like to have your artwork featured on this channel, I'm happy to do so as long as it has something to do with comic tropes. So, if you have artwork like that, just send it to this email address, comictropes@gmail.com. I will be happy to feature it. On top of that, I will pick a winner randomly who will get a Gachapon prize. This was donated to us by Lunar Shine Store. So, let's roll around. Have several balls in here. All right, I'm going to open it up and see who the winner is. I'm looking away. Number 5, and number 5 was Jeremy. Jeremy, you have won a Gachapon. Let me close this up. Actually, I'll just drop that back in and close this up. And I'm happy to choose a prize out of the Gachapony machine for you. That's what Lunar Shine Store named it. So let's take a look at what you won. These are temporarily all Hellboy Gachapons until I get back to Tokyo. Okay, that got like kind of weird because I thought that it was jammed. It wasn't. But this is a Rasputin figure from Hellboy. These are all Hellboy Gachapons. But I did book my trip back to Japan this November. I will be recording a very special episode there this year. I will also get some more Gachapon prizes for the machine because there are some really cool things that I can get over there. So anyway, Jeremy, I will be sending this your way. Sorry for the weird edit in the middle there. I thought that I jammed the machine up. What else do I have to say? Bone is awesome. I appreciate all the support from my patrons. Hopefully you enjoyed this episode. Just something that I really recommend. Didn't have a lot of jokes for it. Can't always fit that in, but sometimes it's just worth looking critically at what the artist does well. And in this case, I think that it's delicate line work and a big epic story that's really well paced and has great reveals along the way. I didn't get too much into, what the later parts of the comic do so well because I don't want to spoil every issue. I'm looking at a broad overview here. Bone is definitely a unique success in the world of self-publishing and in the world of fantasy and comics. That's not something you get to see a lot of. But I just wanted to give some of my rambling final thoughts here. I appreciate the support. Please remember to hit like and subscribe. If you hit the bell notification, that means that you'll be alerted when a new episode of the show drops. If you want to support the show, you can do a one-time tip on coffee. I also have a Patreon page where you can get various rewards. So just something to keep your mind, I meant keep your eye out for, but maybe keep your mind's eye open. I'm starting to stutter, so I'm cutting some of that stuff out. Just know that I've got some very special stuff coming up. I always do some horror reviews throughout October. For November, I'm planning a crime month, and then very early in 2020, which I know is still a ways away, but in 2020, I'm already planning out an international themed month with some comics that you've absolutely not heard of. So I'm going to some very unique countries to pull some very unique comics. I think that everyone will enjoy that, though. I really do. I'm trying to get stuff that's both, well, it's always for a broad audience. Sometimes it's stuff that you've heard about, and maybe we can joke about some of the bad stuff, or maybe we can learn a new detail about stuff that you've already read from a new critical eye, and sometimes I hope to introduce you to some new things. But I'd be very curious to hear some of your thoughts on Bone. To me, it was a very special comic. It was a long read, 55 months, but it went from 91 to 2004. That's 13 years I was reading that comic, and I was reading it from when it came out to when it finished. It meant a lot to me. I really enjoyed the whole run. I'm curious, some of you have probably, if you've read it in collected volumes, or maybe even in the big one volume. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that. I know I've rambled a lot, so I'm going to cut it off here, but until next time, keep reading comics.